Hey everybody, Jesse Cook here, presenting my mini lesson plan for this week's assignment. For the purposes of this assignment, I chose the domain of 9th, 10th grade English and Language Arts, and the subject of an introduction to Homer's epic poem, The Odyssey. It's a fairly complicated work to try to get in a 10-minute lesson plan, but I feel that the background information provided in this mini lesson plan would be essential and pivotal to students going forward trying to learn and understand the material. So let's go ahead and jump right into everything. For the purposes of this assignment, my instructional goal is to provide students ample background knowledge to allow them to read and understand the text efficiently. Without this background knowledge, students are going to probably become lost in the language used in the poem, seen as it is written over 1,000 years ago. Very, very old work. A lot of the language and a lot of geography and terms could be very confusing to kids. So the goal of this assignment is to provide a background knowledge for them to read through the text and to be able to gain understanding with the knowledge they have learned from this. My instructional objective and student learning objective is at the end of this lesson, students will have enough background knowledge to read and apply the content standard to the Odyssey. In regards to the content standard, for this lesson plan, I chose Course Standard CCSS ELA Literacy 9-10 RL2, and that standard is to determine a theme or central idea of a text and analyze and detail its development over the course of the text, including how it emerges and is shaped and refined by specific details, and to provide an objective summary of the text overall after reading. So essentially, it's going through and making sure that children are understanding what we're having them reading and not simply falling behind or pretending to understand, but really understanding and diving into the text and conceptualizing ideas and images that they have read in the text. Some of the characteristics of student learners that I felt would be important for this aspect right here and for understanding how children learn include the continued reliance on rehearsal as an intentional learning strategy, especially by low-achieving students. Although we're in high school, there's still a good chance that many students will be relying on this, so I need to be sure to look out for that and to try to find different ways for kids to move on from a rote sort of learning like rehearsal to a better set of learning that will help them put information into their long-term memory. Another one of those characteristics that I thought would be important for this is the increasing use of elaboration and organization to learn new material, especially by the higher achieving students. In any class, you're going to have a good mix of high achieving and low achieving students, so I think it's best to look at characteristics of both. That way we can continue on and try to find what works for each individual student as well as the class for a whole. And with this increasing use of elaboration and organization, I feel that these students will really be able to dive into the subject matter we have at hand here in the Odyssey and be able to use some of the speech in there to determine what different metaphors and similes are meant to mean and to really get a grasp and understanding of what Homer's trying to depict here in his work. Another one is the increasing mastery of covert learning strategies, going along with both of them, just allowing children to learn in different ways and to be open to the different ways in which students learn is going to be of great importance to this lesson plan. We also have increasing recognition that knowledge involves understanding interrelationships among ideas. This one I really felt fit into my lesson plan here for the introduction to the Odyssey, seen as interrelationships play a huge role in that, whether it be between gods and Odysseus, between Odysseus and his wife, between his men. There's so many different examples for that, but interrelationships are constantly prevalent in this work, and students will need to be able to pick up on these relationships and define what they mean to fully understand and master the work. And then finally, one of the last characteristics I chose to highlight was the fact that these students at this age have a greater proficiency in interpreting figurative language. Again, when reading a text, especially one difficult like the Odyssey with old wording and different phrases that we're not accustomed to nowadays, interpreting figurative language will be vital for these students. And it is my hope that at this point they've gained enough of a background knowledge in that area that they'll be able to succeed on their own or with some aid from the teacher in the situation. In regards to prior academic knowledge required for teaching this course, I said that students should be able to read and comprehend texts, obviously. They're at a high school level. Their reading and comprehension level should be high enough that they can delve into the work and fully understand what they're reading without having to go back and relearn essentially how to read. They should have those skills set already. Students will also need to understand the geographic region of Greece, as it's going to be taught in this lesson plan in order for them to better conceptualize space within the book. There's a lot of different talk of different areas and passageways that Odysseus sails through and different islands that he lands on, so students should have a better understanding of the geography of the Greek nation are going to be better able to interpret the whereabouts of Odysseus's travels and what different things mean as far as when he's turned away and sent in different directions. And finally, students will also need to be able to think in abstract form to understand the meanings and interpretations of the text. The text is going to be dealing with a lot of ideas that are not common to today's standards. There's elements of magic, there's different gods, there's different language used, and students will need to be able to think in abstract terms and meanings in order to fully comprehend and understand these and apply it to the text. Next in my lesson plan, I thought we'd move on to some of the big vocabulary words that we'd be coming across in this lesson. There aren't as many. I didn't want to delve in and pick out the vocabulary words from the text, seeing as that's things students will encounter on their own, such as the different gods, locations, creatures. That's something they'll encounter on their own, but some of the big vocabulary words I did determine that they will need to know going in include things like Greece, where the story takes place, mythology, the area of what the story is. It's a Greek mythology story. Geography, again, the geography of Greece and the geography of the seas, the Mediterranean around it, and Odysseus' travel. I also felt that terms such as simile, metaphor, and allegory were vocabulary words that should be gone over, since they will be included frequently in the text, and students will need to understand and pick up on what these different meanings are and these different allusions are. And finally, before we get into the actual instructional techniques and activities, some of the misconceptions that I thought needed to point out in this lesson plan include the idea that some students may still struggle with the idea that not everything they read isn't actual fact and could be complete fiction. Most students at this age should be well beyond this phase of their life, but there will be some slower developers and some slow achieving students who may still have a hard time interpreting the idea that not everything they read is actual fact. Also, I thought another main thing to put in is that many students, especially in this day and age, are going to feel that the text is irrelevant to today's world, seeing as it was written so long ago. While the text was written long ago, it does still carry meanings and messages that transist over different generations and centuries, and the story itself is still one that is very relevant to today's society, and I just want to make sure students know that. Finally, I wanted to put down that mythology was a way that ancient peoples interpreted the world around them and was not simply made-up stories. So while there might be some crazy elements to some of these mythological stories, they're not simply just made up for the purpose of storytelling. They were created as a way to describe events occurring around them and as to why things were happening. So now that we have an idea of kind of what we're going to do, let's jump into the sequence of instructional activities that we're going to do to present this lesson. The first thing I would like to do for this is to present a map of Greece to the class. You'll either have a projector screen or a computerized image where you can pull up Greece and the surrounding Mediterranean area. This way we can go through and point out that Greece is a peninsula and it is surrounded by water on all three sides, and that is why so much of the story is taking place on open sea, because of the fact of Greece's geography. After that, we'll go ahead and look at different waterways and straits located in the Mediterranean. You have the Ionian Sea, the Aegean Sea, your various straits where Odysseus will end up. We'll go through and look at those to make sure students understand the path of the travel Odysseus will be taking in his journey. After students are kind of comfortable with that, I think it's a good idea to point out some of the major city-states in the Greek nation, Athens, Sparta, Syracuse, etc. Those are all different areas we're going to want to point out because they will all be of importance to understand that these cities were connected in culture, but not connected in ruling. They ruled themselves, although they, for the most part, maintained the same sort of culture. And then we'll go ahead and look at different landmarks such as Ithaca. We'll very much want to point out the home world of Odysseus. The island of Ithaca is something we'll want students to see so they can understand where he's making this journey and where he's attempting to get to. Once students have developed a better understanding of the geography of Greece, I'm going to go ahead and inquire to the class as to what they understand about or know about mythology in general. While this is a short lesson plan and we won't have too much time to delve into things, the best thing to do is to make sure you do give the students a few seconds to answer questions on their own instead of jumping right in and telling them. Giving them that few seconds allows their brain to retrieve information they priorly learned, and with you allowing them to input their insight forward as opposed to simply telling them what's going on, there's a good chance they'll be more engaged and ready to participate in the upcoming activities. Once we've gone over that, we'll start with a brief introduction to some of the gods in Greek lore. We'll obviously go over Zeus, Poseidon, Hades, and Athena, four of the major ones. Poseidon, especially in relation to this story, will be one that we'll have to cover. Once we go through and talk about the gods, we'll also talk about some of the creatures, such as the Cyclops, the Sirens, the different creatures and sorceress we'll find throughout the story. We'll briefly introduce those and talk to those so that when students encounter these gods and these terms in the book, they won't be as confused. They'll have a better understanding and really know what's going on. And that will help them delve into the reading and better understand and conceptualize the meaning from the text when they're not constantly having to question who this individual is, what they're supposed to do, what their realm is. After we've discussed all of these topics, including the geography, the concept of mythology, and the creatures and gods in Greek mythology, there'll be a brief exercise and activity that's passed out, and it will involve matching the gods and the creatures to their domains and their abilities. So for instance, we'd have Poseidon on the left with an answer of God of the Sea on the right, and the students would then connect a line there from Poseidon to the God of the Sea in order to fully grasp what's going on. There will also be a blank map of Greece at this point where students will fill in the major land area locations, waterways that we discussed. And once this has been turned in and corrected, any additional questions will be answered. One of the reasons to do this activity alone is it brings questions to light. If students are struggling with this activity prior to getting the book, they're more likely to ask questions, and by asking those questions ahead of time, we should have a better ability to put them on the right path to understanding in regards to the text. Once these activities have been done, we'll obviously leave the floor open for discussion if kids have further questions they want to relate. If not, students can go on and start their reading on their own. A major element at this point is to make sure that you're maintaining a level of with itness in the classroom and still monitoring the students even though they're reading. Many students could be off track, playing on their phones, fiddling with something, just not reading at all, and we need to make sure that students are actively reading. You also, as the teacher and myself, I'm going to have to make sure that I'm available to answer any of these questions that students have and to not simply shrug it off and ask them to look for things on their own. It's a complicated text, but it is quite enjoyable for many students this age, and I feel overall most students would have an enjoyable time in this sort of a learning environment and this learning setting here. Anyways, thank you for listening.